Father Girdlestone's Tale. "I have found another raconteur for this evening," said Monsignor as he came in to dinner on the following day. "But he cannot be here till late." The rector looked up questioningly. "Yes, I know," said Monsignor, unfolding his napkin. "But it is a long story. It will take at least 2 nights. But it is a beauty, Reverend Fathers." We murmured appreciatively. "I heard him tell it 20 years ago," proceeded the priest. "I was a boy then. I had a bad night after it, I remember, but the first part is rather dull." The appreciative murmur was even louder. "Well then, is that settled?" We assented. The entrance of Father Girdlestone that evening was somewhat dramatic. We were all talking briskly together in our wide semicircle when Father Brent uttered an exclamation. The talk died, and I, turning from my corner, saw a very little old man standing behind the rector's chair, motionless and smiling. He was one of the smallest men, not actually deformed, I have ever seen. Small and very delicate looking. His white, silky hair was thin on his head, but abundant over his ears. His face was like thin ivory, transparent and exquisitely carved. His eyes so overhung that I could see nothing of them but 2 patches of shadow with a diamond in each. And there he stood, as if materialized from air, beneath the folds of his ample Roman cloak. "I beg your pardon, Reverend Fathers," he said, and his voice was as delicate as his complexion. "I tapped, but no one seemed to hear me." The rector bustled from his chair. "My dear father," he began, but Monsignor interrupted. "A most appropriate entry, Father Girdlestone," he said. "You could not have made a more effective beginning." He moved his hand. "Father Girdlestone," he said, introducing us, "and this is the Father Rector." We were all standing up by now, looking at this tranquil little old man, and we bowed and murmured deferentially. It was something very dignified about this priest. Then chairs were resorted. I got my own again, moving it against the wall, watching him as, with almost foreign manners, he bowed this way and that before seating himself in the center. Then we all sat down. After a word or two of talk, he began. "I understand from my friend Monsignor Maxwell," he said, "that you gentlemen would like to hear my story. I am very willing indeed to tell it. No possible harm can follow from it, and perhaps even good may be the result, if ever anyone who shall hear it is afflicted with the same visitation. But it is a long story, gentlemen, and I am an old man, and shall no doubt make it longer." He was reassured, I think, by our faces, and without further apology he began his tale. "My first and only curacy," he said, "was in the town of Cardiff. I was sent there after my ordination, 4 years before the re-establishment of the hierarchy in England, and the year after our bishops were given us, I was sent to found a mission inland. Now, gentlemen, I shall not tell you where that was, though no doubt you will be able to find out if you desire to do so. It will be enough now to describe to you the circumstances and the place. It was a little colliery village to which I went. We will call it Abergwyll. There were a number of Irish Catholics there, who are, as you know, the most devout persons on the face of the earth. They begged very hard for a priest, and I suspect, gentlemen, there was a collusion in the matter. The bishop's chaplain had Irish blood. He smiled pleasantly. At least, there I was sent, with a stipend of £40 and a letter of commendation and permission to beg. My parishioners set at my disposal a 4-roomed house standing on the outskirts of the village, removed, I should say, 40 yards from any other house. Behind my house was open country, a kind of moor, stretching over hill and dale to the mountains of Brecon. The colliery itself stood on the further side of the village and beneath it, half a mile away. Of the 4 rooms, I used one as a chapel on the ground floor. That at the back was the kitchen. I slept over the kitchen and used as my sitting room and sacristy the room over the chapel. I will not detain you with my first experiences. They were most edifying. I have never seen such devotion and fervor. My own devotion was sensibly increased by all that I heard and saw. The shepherd in this case, at least, was taught many lessons by his sheep. Now, the first ambition of every young priest who is worthy of the name is to build a great church to God's glory. Even I had this ambition. I had not a great deal of work to do. In fact, I may say that there was really nothing to do except say Mass and office and to conduct evening devotions as I did every night in the chapel. And that little chapel, gentlemen, was full every night. Much of the day, therefore, I spent in walking and dreaming. In the morning, as summer came on, I was accustomed to take my office book out with me, go over the moor, perhaps 300 yards away, to a little ravine where a stream went down into the valley. There I would sit on the shade of a rock, listening to the voice of the water and saying my prayers. When I had done, I would lie on my back, looking up at the rock and the sky and dreaming. Well, as every young priest dreams. I do not know when it was that I first understood what God intended me to do. I began by thinking of a great town where my church should stand, Cardiff or perhaps Newport. I even arranged its architecture. It would be a primitive Roman basilica, large and plain, with an apse with a Christ in glory frescoed. On his right were to be the redeemed, and on his left the lost. No more than that, with a pair of great angels behind the throne. That, gentleman, without text or comment, has always seemed to me the greatest sermon on earth. He paused and looked round us at an instant. Well, gentlemen, you know what daydreaming is. I even occupied my time, with £40 a year and 30 collier parishioners, in drawing designs for my church. And then suddenly, on a summer's day, a new thought came to me, and something else with it. I was lying on my back on the short grass, looking up at the rock against the sky, when the thought came to me that here the basilica should stand. The rock should be levelled, I thought, to a platform. The foundations should be blasted out, and here my church should stand alone on the moor to witness to the demands of God's glory, were dominant and sovereign. Yes, gentlemen, most unpractical and fantastic. I sat up at the thought. It came to me as a revelation. In that instant, I no more doubted that it should be accomplished than that God reigned. I looked below me at the stream. Yes, I saw it all. There the stream should dash and clatter. All about me were the solemn moors, and here on the rock behind me should stand my basilica and the blessed sacrament within it. I was just about to turn to look at my rock again, when something happened. The old man stopped dead. Now, gentlemen, I do not know if I can make this plain to you. What happened to me happened only interiorly. but it was as real as a thunderclap or a vision. It was this. It was an absolute conviction that something was looking at me from over the top of the rock behind. My first thought was that I had heard a sound. Then simultaneously a horn blew from the colliery a mile away, and he hesitated. I was aware that this external sound was on a different plane. I do not know how to make that plain to you, but it was as when one's imagination is full of some remembered melody and a real sound breaks upon it. The horn ceased and there was silence again. Then after a moment more, my interior experience ceased too, as abruptly as it had begun. All that time, 3 or 4 seconds, I had sat still and rigid without turning my head. I must describe to you, as well as I can, my sensations during those seconds. You must forgive me for being verbose about it. Those who have attained to St. Teresa's prayer of quiet tell us that it is a new world into which they consciously penetrate, a world with objects, sounds, and all the rest, but that these entirely incommunicable even to the brain of the recipient. No adequate image or analogy can be found for those intuitions. Still less can they be expressed in words. I suppose that this is an illustration of the truth that the kingdom of heaven is within us. Well, gentlemen, I was aware during those seconds that I was in that state, that I had, as it were, stepped through the crust of the world of sense and even of intellectual thought. What I perceived of a person watching me was not on this plane at all. It was not one who in any sense had a human existence, who had ever had one, or ever would have one. It did not in the least resemble, therefore, an apparition of the dead, but the perception of this was gradual, as also the nature of the visitation of which I shall speak in a moment. At first there was only the act of the entrance into my neighborhood, as of one entering a room. Then gradually, although with great speed, I perceived the nature of the visitation and the character of the visitant. And again that sound, if I may call it so, was not that of a material object. It was not a cry, or a word, or a movement, yet it was in some way the expression of a personality. Shall we say, he stopped again. Well, do you know what the sound of a flame is? There's not exactly a vibration, not a note, nor a roar, nor anything. Well, I do not think I can express it more clearly than by saying that this is the nearest analogy I can name in the world of sense. It was as the note of a vivid and intense personality, and it continued during that period and died noiselessly at the end, like a sudden singing in the ears. Now I've taken the sense of hearing as the one which best expresses my experience, but it was not really hearing any more than seeing or tasting or feeling. It seemed to me that if it was true, as scientists tell us, that we have but one common sense expressing itself in 5 ways, that common sense was indirectly affected in this intense and piercing way only beneath its own plane, if I may say so. And one thing more, although this presence seemed to bring a kind of paralysis so that I did not move or even objectively think, yet beneath, my soul was aware of a repulsion and a hatred that I am entirely unable to describe. As God is absolute goodness and love, so this presence affected me with precisely the opposite instinct. There, I must leave it at that. I must just ask you to take my word for it that there was present to me during those few seconds a kind of distilled quintessence of all that is not God, under the aspect of a person and of a person, as I have said, quite apart from human existence. The priest's quiet little voice, speaking now even lower than he began, yet perfectly articulate and unmoved, ceased, and I leaned back in my chair, drawing a long breath. Again, I will only speak for myself and say that he had seemed to be putting into words for the first time in my experience something which I had never undergone, and which yet I recognized as simply true. I doubted it no more than if he had described a walk he had taken in Rome. He looked round at the motionless faces, lifted one knee onto the other, and began to nurse it. Well, gentlemen, if it would be about 10 minutes, I suppose, before I stood up. I looked over my shoulder before that, yet knowing I should see nothing, and indeed there was nothing to see but the old rock and the sky, and the silhouette of the grasses against it, I continued to sit there, because I felt too tired to move. It was a kind of complete languor that took possession of me. I had no actual fear now. I knew that the thing, whatever it was, had withdrawn itself. It had whisked, if I may say so, out of my range, as swift as a lizard who knows himself observed. I knew perfectly well that it would approach more cautiously if it should ever approach me again. But that for the present I need not fear. There was another curious detail too. I had, and have now, no reflex horror when I think of it. You see that it had not taken place before my senses, not even indeed before my intellect or my conscious powers. It was completely in the transcendent sphere, and therefore, at least I can only suppose that this is the reason, therefore when the door was shut, and I was returned to my human existence, I had no associations or even direct memory of the horror. I knew it had taken place, but my objective imagination was not tarnished by it. Later it was different, but I shall come to that presently. There was the languor, taking its rise, I suppose, in the very essence of my being, where I had experienced and resisted the assault, and this languor communicated itself to my mind, just as weariness of mind communicates itself to the body. Then, after a little rest, I got up and went home. It was curious also that after dining the languor had risen even higher. I felt intolerably tired, and slept dreamlessly in my chair the whole afternoon. That then, gentlemen, was the beginning of my visitation. It was only the beginning, and to some degree differed from its continuation. It seemed to me later, when I looked back upon it, that the personality had changed its assault somewhat, and at first it had rushed upon me unthinking, impelled by its own passion, and afterwards it laid siege with skill and deliberation. But are you sure, gentlemen, that I am not boring you with all this? Monsignor answered for us. I noticed he cleared his throat slightly before speaking. No, father, please go on. The old priest paused a moment as if to recollect himself. Then, still nursing his knee, he began again in his quiet little voice. I do not know exactly how long it was before I began to understand my danger, but I think the first thought occurred to me one day during my meditation. Soon after my ordination, I had read Madame Guyon's book on prayer in order to understand exactly what it was that had been condemned in quietism, and I suppose it had affected me to some extent. It is indeed a very subtle book and extremely beautiful. At any rate, I had long been accustomed to close my meditation with what she calls the awful silence in the presence of God. I do not think that, normally speaking, there is any harm in this. On the contrary, for active-minded people in danger of intellectualism, I think it's very useful exercises. Well, it was one day, I should think within a fortnight of my experience by the rock, that I first understood that for me there was a danger. I was in my little chapel before the Blessed Sacrament. Everything was quite quiet. The men were at work, the women in their houses. It was a hot, sunny morning, I remember, breathlessly still. I'd finished my formal meditation and was sitting back in my chair. You all know, gentlemen, of course, the way in which one can approach the silence before God. Of course, the simplest can do it if they will take pains. Monsignor Maxwell interrupted, still in that slightly strained voice in which he had spoken just now. Please describe it, he said. The priest looked up deprecatingly. Well then, first, I had withdrawn myself from the world of sense. That takes, sometimes several minutes. It is necessary to sink down in thought in such a manner that sounds no longer distract the attention, even though they may be heard, and even considered and reflected upon. Then the second step is to leave behind all intellectual considerations and images. And that, too, is sometimes troublesome, especially if the mind is naturally active. Well, this day I found an extraordinary ease in both the acts. Father Brent leaned forward. May I interrupt, Father? But I'm not sure that I understand. The old man pursed his lips. Then he glanced up at the rest of us almost apologetically. Well, it is this, my dear Father. How can I put it? It is the introversion of the soul. Instead of considering this object or that, either by looking upon it or reflecting upon it, the soul turns inwards. There are the two distinct planes on which many men, especially those who pay little or no attention to the soul, live continually. Either they continually seek distractions, they cannot be devout except in company or before an image, or else, as indeed many do, who have even the gift of recollection, they dwell entirely upon considerations and mental images. Now, the true introversion is beneath all this. The soul sinks, turning inward upon itself. There are no actual considerations at all. Those become, in their turn, as much distractions to the energy of the soul as external objects to the energy of the mind. Is that clearer, my dear Father? It was all said with a kind of patient and apologetic simplicity. Father Brent nodded pensively 2 or 3 times, dropped his chin again upon his hand, and the old priest went on. Well, gentlemen, as I said just now, on this morning I came into the silence without an effort. First, the sensible world dropped away. I heard a woman open and shut her door 50 yards away down the street, but it was no more than a sound. Then almost immediately the world of images and considerations went past me and vanished, and I found myself in perfect stillness. For an instant it seemed to me that all was well. There was a strange tranquility all about me. I cannot put it into words except by saying, as all do who practice that method, that it is a living tranquility full of a very vital energy. This is not, of course, that to which contemplatives penetrate. St. John of the Cross makes that very plain. It is no more than that in which we ought always to live. It is that kingdom of God within, of which our blessed Lord tells us. But it is not the palace itself. However, as I have said, when one has but learnt the way there, and the difficulty of doing so lies only in its extreme and singular simplicity, when one has learnt the way there, it is full of pleasure and consolation. I remained there as my manner was, drawing a long breath or two, as one is obliged to do. I do not know why. And at first, all seemed well. There was that peace about me which may be described under the image of any one of the five senses. I prefer to speak of it now as the image of light, a radiant, mellow light full of warmth and sweetness. There was, too, just at first that sense of profound abasement and adoration which is so familiar. As I said, gentlemen, I do not, of course, for an instant pretend to the gift of pure contemplation. That is something far beyond. Then, all in an instant, that sense of adoration vanished. Now it was not that I had risen back again to meditation. There were no images before my attention, no reflections of any formulated kind. It was still the pure perception, and yet all sense of adoration and of God's majesty was gone. The light and the peace were there, but not God. Then I perceived, if I may say so, that something was on the point of disclosure. It was as if something was about to manifest itself. I perceived that the light was not as it had been. It was like that strange, vivid sunlight that we see sometimes when a very heavy cloud is overhead. That is the only way in which I can express it. It is for that reason that I called it light, rather than sound or touch. For an instant still I hesitated. The thought of what had happened to me by the rock never came to my mind, and with inconceivable swiftness the process passed on. To use an auditory metaphor for a moment, it was like the change of an orchestra. The minor note steals in, a blight passes over the character of the sound, and simultaneously the volume increases, the chords expand, tearing the heart with them, and the listener perceives that a moment later the climax will break in thunder. He had raised his voice a little by now. His eyes glanced this way and that, though still without a trace of self-consciousness. Then again his voice dropped. Well, gentlemen, before that final moment came, I had remembered. The vision of the rock and the clatter of the stream was before me, sharp as a landscape under lightning. I do not know what I did, but I was aware of making a kind of terrified effort. My soul sprang up as a diver who chokes underwater, and in an instant the whole thing was gone. Then I became aware that my eyes were open and that I was standing up. I was still terrified by the suddenness of the experience, and stood there saying something aloud to our Lord in the tabernacle. Then I heard the door open behind me. "Did you cry out, Father?" said Bridget. "Why, Mother of Mercy!" I felt myself beginning to sway on my feet. Well, gentlemen, I need not trouble you with all that. The truth was that Bridget, who was washing up my breakfast things in the kitchen, heard me cry out. She told me afterwards that when she saw my face, she thought I was dying. I sat down a little then, and she fetched me something, and presently I was able to walk out. Well, gentlemen, that is enough for this evening. He stopped abruptly. We got up and went to night prayers. Part 2. Well, so far, began Father Girdlestone on the following evening, so far you see two things had happened to me. First, there seems to have been a kind of unpremeditated assault that affected me mind, body, and soul. That was the attack by the rock. Then he began to lay siege more deliberately, and attacked me in my meditation, in what I may call the innermost chamber, the antechamber to the transcendent world. Now, I have to tell you of his next assault. There was a rustle of expectation as we settled ourselves to listen. I had found, on questioning the others in the morning, that they were in the same attitude as myself, impressed, but not convinced. Indeed, strangely impressed by the extreme subtlety of the experience related to us, yet there had been no proof, no tangible evidence, such as we are accustomed to demand, and the incidents had been anything more than subjective. At the same time, there had been something remarkable in the priest's assurance, as well as in the precise particularity of his narrative. It seemed now, however, from what he said, that perhaps we were to have more materialistic elements presented to us. The result, of course, continued Father Girdlestone, of the attack upon my soul was that I became terrified at the thought of any further act of introversion. It seemed to me, on reflection, that I had probably overstrained my faculties a little, that I had better be more distinctly meditative in my devotion. I fetched down, therefore, from my shelves a copy of the Spiritual Exercises and set to work. I began with a carefully objective act of the presence of God, dwelling chiefly upon the Blessed Sacrament, and then pursued carefully the lines laid out. 2 or 3 times every day, I should say, I was tempted to fall back upon the prayer of the quiet. and each time I resisted it. It was a kind of frightened fascination that I felt for it. It was as if it had been a cupboard where something terrible worked. In silence and darkness, ready to tear me if I opened the door. Of course, I should have opened it boldly. Any priest of experience would have told me so at once. But I did not fully understand what was wrong. The result was, as you all shall hear. All went well for several days. I meditated with care, making the prescribed considerations. The preludes, the pictures, and all the rest. Observing to go straight from the intellectual act to the voluntary. I became soothed and content again. Then, without any warning, the new assault was made. It came about in this fashion. I was meditating upon the particular judgment and had formed the picture, as visibly as possible, of my soul before the judge. I saw the wounds and the stains on one side, the ineffably pierced grace and holiness on the other. I saw the reproach in the judge's face. I seized my soul by the neck, as it were, and crushed it down in humility and penitence. And then suddenly it seemed to me that my hold relaxed and all faded. Now this assault came to me in intellectual form, yet I cannot remember the arguments. It began, if I may say so, as a blot upon the subject of my meditation, effacing the image of the judge and of myself. It spread with inconceivable swiftness over the whole of my faith. The priest paused, smiling steadily at the fire. How shall I put it? He said. Well, in a word, it was intellectual doubt of the whole thing. A kind of cloud of infidelity seemed to envelop me. I beat against it, but it poured on, thick and black. There seemed to me no person behind it. It was the very negative of personality that surrounded me. After all, it seemed to say to me, yet without words or intellect you understand, after all, this is a pretty picture, but where is the proof? What shadow of proof is there that the whole thing is not a dream? If there were objective proof, how could any man doubt? If there were not objective proof, what reason have you to trust in religion at all? Far more to sacrifice your life to it. Death, too! What is that but the resolving of the elements that issue in what you call the soul? And when the elements resolve, the soul disperses. And so on and so on. You know it, gentlemen. It suggested hostile things against our Lord when I turned to the tabernacle, and then again, on a sudden, as it had done in the deeper plane, it spread upwards to an intolerable climax. I began to see myself as a dying spark in a burned-out world, and there was no escape, for there was nothing but empty space about me. No God, no heaven, not even a devil to hint at life in some form, at least after death. I looked during those seconds into the gulf of annihilation. I cried out in my heart that I would sooner live in hell than die there. And the vision, if I may call it so, of ultimate eternal blackness cleared every instant before my intellect until it was imminent upon me as a demonstrable certainty. And then once more, before that loomed out, as actually intellectually certain, I struggled and stood up, saying something aloud, the name of God, I think, with the sweet poured, while the sweat poured down my face. It passed then, at least in its acuteness. There was the little domed tabernacle before me with its white curtains, and the altar cards, and the gilt candlesticks. And a woman went past the window in clogs, and I heard a bird twitter beneath the eaves. And it was all for a while natural and peaceful again. The priest stopped. "Now, gentlemen," he said very slowly, "intellectual difficulties have occurred to most people, I imagine. How should it not be so? If religion was small enough for our intellects, it could not be great enough for our soul's requirements. But this was not just that fleeting, transient obscurity that we call intellectual difficulty. It was to ordinary darkness what substance is to imagination, what a visible concrete scene is to a fancy, what life is to dreaming. I know I cannot express what I mean, but I want you to take it on my word that this visitation in the realm of the intellect was a solid blackness, compared with which all other difficulties I have ever heard of or experienced are as a mere lowering of intellectual lights. It was paralleled only by my experience in introversion. That too had not been an emotional withdrawal or a spiritual dryness, as we commonly use those words. It had been a solid, unutterably heavy burden, real beyond description. And further, I want you to consider my dilemma. I had been rooted in my soul and dared not take refuge there. I had been overwhelmed too in my intellect. And even when the first misery had passed, it seemed to me that the arguments against the faith were stronger than those for it. I did not dare to put one against the other. A heavy deposit had been left upon my understanding. I did not dare to sit down and argue. I did not dare to run for refuge to the silence of God. I was driven out into the sole thing that was left, the world of sense. Again he stopped, still with that tranquil smile. I hardly understood him, though I think I saw very dimly what he called his dilemma, yet I did not understand what he meant by the world of sense. After a little pause he went on. "To the world of sense," he repeated. It seemed to me now that this was all that was left. I determined then and there to drop my meditation and to confine myself to Mass, office, and rosary. I would say the words with my lips, quickly and steadily, keeping my mind fixed upon them rather than upon their meaning. I would trust that presently the clouds would pass. Well, gentlemen, for about 2 months I continued this. The misery I suffered is simply indescribable. You can imagine all the suggestions I made to myself when I was off my guard. I told myself I was a coward and a sham, that I had lost my faith, that I continued to act as a priest. What was especially hard to bear was the devotion of my parishioners. As I knelt in front, saying the rosary, and they responded, I could hear the thrill of conviction in every word they uttered. Oh, those Irish! The things they said to me sometimes were like swords for pain, the masses they asked me to say. I went to a priest at a distance once or twice and told him the bare outline, not as I have told it to you. He laughed at me, kindly of course. He told me that it was the effect of loneliness, while I knew that at the best it was the work of one who bore me continually company now, and who was stronger than I. He told me that all young priests had to win the victory in some form or other, that every priest thought his own case the most desperate. Yet I knew from every word that he said that he did not understand, and that I could never make him understand. Yet somehow I set my teeth. I told God that I was willing to bear this dereliction for as long as he willed. So paradoxical and mysterious is the gift of faith, if he would but save my soul. And at last, in a kind of defiance, I began to look once more at my designs for the church I was to build. You see, gentlemen, what I meant by taking refuge in the world of sense. I deliberately contemplated never daring to face God again interiorly, or even my own soul. I would do my duty as a priest. I would say my Mass and office. I would preach strictly what the church enjoined. I would live and die like that, with my teeth set. Better God, beaten and denied, than all the world beside in prosperity. For the first time in the whole of his narrative, Father Girdlestone's voice trembled a little. He passed his thin old hand over his mouth once more, and shifted his position, and began again. It was on the 1st of October that I took down my plans. I had not looked at them for 2 months. I had not the heart to do so. Now, let me describe to you exactly the room in which I sat and the other necessary circumstances. In the centre of my room stood my table with 2 windows to my left. The fire in front of me and the door behind me on the right. The windows were hung with serge curtains. I had no carpet, but a little mat beneath my table and another in front of the fire. It was in the beginning of October, to be accurate, the 3rd of the month, that this thing happened that I am about to tell you. I awoke early that morning, said my mass as usual, with attention and care, but no sensible devotion, and after my thanksgiving, sat down to breakfast. It was then that I first had any uneasiness. I was breakfasting at my table, and beyond me, in front and to the right, stood a large basket chair. I was reading some book or other, and could honestly say that nothing was further from my mind than my experiences in the summer. Remember, during 2 months nothing had happened, nothing at least, beyond that intolerable intellectual darkness. Then, the basket chair suddenly clicked, in the way in which they do half an hour after one has sat in them. It distracted my attention for an instant. It was just enough for that, no more. I went on with my book. Then it clicked again. 3, 4 times. And I looked up, rather annoyed. Well, to be brief, this went on and on. After breakfast, when Bridget came to fetch the tray, I asked her whether she had touched the chair that morning. She told me no. All this time, remember, no thought of anything odd had entered my head. I suppose it was the damp, and said so. Well, she was still in the room when I went out to fetch my breviary from the chapel. But as I set foot on the stairs, leaving the door open behind me, I heard her, as I thought, come out after me with the tray and follow me 3 or 4 steps behind, all down the staircase. I had no more doubt of that than the fact that I myself was going downstairs. At the turn of the stairs, I did not even look behind. By the sounds, not clear footfalls, you understand, but a kind of shuffling and breathing, and still more by the consciousness that there she was, I judged she was in a hurry, as she often was. At the foot of the stairs, I turned to say something. As I began to turn, I will swear that I saw a figure out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, it was simply not there. There was nothing there. Do you understand, gentlemen? Nothing at all. I called up to her and heard her come across the floor. Then she looked over the banister. Did you come out of the room just now? I said. No, Your Reverence. Well, I made my theory, of course. It was to the effect that she had moved in the room as I came out, and I therefore thought she was following me, and that the rest was simply self-suggestion. I got my breviary and came out. As I came into the little lobby again, there occurred to me the impression that someone was there, waiting in the corner. I looked round me. There was nothing. And I went upstairs. Gentlemen, do you know that nervous condition when one feels there is someone in the room? It is generally dissipated in 10 minutes conversation. Well, I was in that condition all the morning. There was more than that. It was not only that sense of someone there. There were sounds now and then, faint but distinct, from all quarters. Sounds so minute and unimportant in themselves that I might have heard them 100 times without giving them another thought, if they had not been accompanied by that sense of a presence with me. They were of all kinds. Once or twice, a piece of woodwork somewhere in the room clicked. as my breakfast chair had done. A sharp, minute rap, such as one hears in damp weather. Once the door became unlatched and slid very softly with the sound of a hush over a piece of matting that lay there. I got up and shut the door, looking, I must confess, for an instant onto the landing. As I came back to my chair, that clicked twice. Gentlemen, I know this sounds absurd. You will be saying, as I said, that I was simply in a nervous condition. Very well. Perhaps I was. But please wait. Once, as I sat in my chair, drawn sideways near the fireplace, a very slight movement caught my eye. I turned sharply. It was no more than the fringe of the mat under the table lifting in a draught. As I looked, it ceased. Well, my nerves got worse and worse. I stared every now and again round the room. There was nothing to be seen but the boards, the mats, the furniture, the black and white crucifix over the mantel shelf, my few books, and the vestment chest near the door. There were the curtains, too, hanging at the windows. That was all. It was a cloudy October day, and rained a little about 12:30. I remember starting suddenly as a gust came and dashed the drops against the glass. At about 1:15, Bridget came in to lay dinner. I'm ashamed to say it, but I was extraordinarily relieved when I heard her open the downstairs door. She came in, you remember, 3 or 4 times a day to see after me. Otherwise, I was alone in the house. When she came into the room, I looked up at her. She smiled at me, and then seemed to me that her face took on it a rather odd expression. She stopped smiling, and before she set down the tablecloth and knives, she looked round the room rather curiously, I thought. "Well, Bridget," I said, "what is it?" There was a moment before she answered. "It's nothing, Your Reverence," she said. Then she laid dinner. I dined, reading all the while. She brought in the dishes one by one. I'm afraid I hurried rather over dinner. I made up my mind to go out for a long walk. There was something else in my mind, too. Well, I may as well tell you, it seemed to me that I should rather like to be out of the house before she was. Yes, it was cowardly, but remember that all this while I was telling myself that I had an attack of the nerves, that I had better not be alone except in the fresh air. Well, nothing at all happened that afternoon. It seemed to me, as I went over the moors, that all sense of haunting had ceased. I noticed first consciously that it had gone soon after leaving the outskirts of the village. I was entirely happy and serene. As I came back into the sight of the village at dusk and saw the lights shining over the hill, the uneasiness came on me again. It struck me vividly for the first time that a night spent alone in that house would be slightly uncomfortable. By this time, of course, too, the possibility of a connection between my present state and my other experiences had occurred in my mind, but I had striven to resist this idea as merely one of nervous suggestion. My uneasiness grew greater as I came up the street. I'm ashamed to say that I stopped to talk 3 or 4 times to my parishioners, simply out of the unaccountably strong terror of my own house. I noticed, too, across the street, that a face peeped from Bridget's window and drew back on seeing me. A moment later, the door opened and she came out. I did not turn or wait for her, but as I reached my door, I was conscious of a very distinct relief that she was behind me, and as I went in, she came immediately after me. "I'm very sorry, Father," she said. "I haven't your tea ready yet." I told her to bring it as soon as she could, and went slowly upstairs with the horror deepening at every step. I knew perfectly well now why she had waited. It was that she did not like to enter the empty house alone. Yet I did not feel that I could ask her what it was that she feared. That would be a kind of surrender on my part, and allowing to myself that there was something to fear, and you must remember that I was still trying to tell myself that it was all nerves. The rector leaned forward. "I'm very sorry, Father Girdlestone," he said softly, "but it is past time for night prayers." He paused. "But may we make an exception tonight and hear the rest afterwards?" The old man stood up and motioned with a little smile towards the chapel gallery. Part 3. "As I went forward into the room," began the old man again, as soon as we had taken our seats in silence, "I knew beyond doubt that I was accompanied. I heard Bridget moving about upstairs, but it was a sound heard through a roar of a train. There went with me something resembling a loud noise interiorly. On the brink of manifestation in the world of sense, we may call it a blackness, or a vast weight as heavy as heaven and earth. And it was all centered round personality. It was of such a nature that I should have been surprised at nothing. It appeared to me that all that I looked upon, the curtains, table, chair, the glow of the fire, the glimmer of the bare boards, all these were but as melting shreds and rags hang upon some monstrous reality. They were there. They were just in existence, but they were as accidents without substance. I do not know if there were definite sounds or not, or even definite appearances, beyond the normal material sounds and sights. There may have been, but I do not think so. I went across the room, walking, it seemed to me, on nothingness. My body was still in sensible relations with matter, but it seemed to me that I was not. I found my chair, sat down in it to wait. I was nerveless now, sunk in a kind of despair that I cannot hope to make plain to you. I imagine that a lost soul on the edge of death must be in that state. I looked almost vacantly round the room once or twice, but there was nothing. I understood without consideration what was happening, and the general course of events. It was all one, I perceive now. That which had started up at the rock, which had invaded first the innermost chamber of my soul, and then the intellectual plane, and had established itself there, had taken its final step forward, and was claiming the world of sense as well. I felt entirely powerless. You will wonder why I did not go downstairs to the Blessed Sacrament. I do not know, but it was impossible. Here was the battlefield, I knew very well. I perceived something else too. The reason of the assaults. I did not fully understand it, but I knew that the object was to drive me from the place, to make the village and neighborhood no interior detestable to me. I knew that I could escape by going away, yet it was not exactly a temptation. I had no interior desire to escape. It was merely a question as to which force would prevail in my soul, that which impelled me away, and grace, which held me there. I was a passive dummy between them. I do not know how long it was before Bridget pushed open the door. I saw her with the tray come across the room and set it down upon my table. Then I saw her looking at me. "Bridget," I said, "I shall want no supper tonight. And tell the people that I am unwell, and that there will be no night prayers. There will be Mass, I hope, as usual, in the morning." I said these words, I believe, but the voice was not as my own. It was as if another spoke. I saw her looking at me across the dusk with an extraordinary terror in her face. "Come away, father," she whispered. I shook my head. "Come away," she whispered again. "This is not a good house to be in." I said nothing. "Shall I fetch Father Donovan for your father?" she whispered. "Or the doctor?" "Fetch no one," I said to her. "Tell no one. Ask for prayers if you will. Go and leave me to myself, Bridget." I think I understood even then what the struggle was she was going through. I do not know if she perceived all that I perceived, but even from our face, without her words, I knew that she was conscious of something, yet she did not like to leave me alone. She stood perfectly still, looking first at me, and slowly round the room, then back at me, and as she looked, the dusk fell veil on veil, and suddenly something happened. I do not know what. I never questioned her afterwards, but she was gone. I heard her stumbling and moaning down the stairs. An instant later, the street door opened and banged, and I was left alone. I cannot tell you what I felt. I knew only that the crisis was come, that the result was out of my hands. I closed my eyes, I think, and lay right back in my chair. It was as if I was submitting myself to an operation. I wondered vaguely as to what shape it would take. All about the room, I felt the force gathering. There was no oscillation, no vibration, but a steady, continuous pressure concentrating itself within the four walls. With this, the sense of the central personality grew every moment more and more intense and vivid. It seemed to me as if I was some tiny conscious speck of matter in the midst of a life whose vastness and malignance was beyond conception. At times it was this, at other times it was as if I looked within and saw a space full of some indescribable blackness, a space of such a nature that I could not tell whether it was tiny as a pinhole or as vast as infinity. It was spaceless space, sheer emptiness, but with an emptiness that was a horror, and it was within me. Yet it was not simple spirit. It was not the correlative of matter. It was rather spirit in the very throes of manifestation in matter. Sometimes then I attended to this. Sometimes I lay with every sensible sense at full stretch, at a tenseness that seemed impossible, directed outwards. I cannot tell even now whether the room was poised in deathly silence or in an indescribable clamour and roar of tongues. It was one or the other, or if it was both at once. Or to take the sense of light, although my eyes were closed, every detail of the room was before me. Sometimes I saw it as rigid as a man at grips with death, in a kind of pallor, the table, the dying fire, the uncurtained window, or in the pallor of the very names of the books invisible, all, as it were, striving to hold themselves in material being under the stress of some enormous destructive force with which they were charged. As rigid and as silent and as significant as an electric wire, and as full of power. Or at times all seemed to me to have gone, simply to have dissolved into nothingness, as a breath fades on a window, to retain but a phantom of themselves. Well, well, words are very useless, gentlemen. They are poor things. The old priest paused a moment, leaning forward in his chair with his thin, veined hands together. For myself, I cannot say what I felt. I seemed to be in somewhat of a state as that which he was describing. All my senses, too, were stretched to the full by the intensity of my attention, yet the narrator seemed little affected. He leaned and looked peacefully into the fire, and I caught the glint of light on his deep eyes. Then he leaned back and went on. Now you must picture yourselves, gentlemen, that this state grew steadily in its energy. I did not know before, and I can scarcely believe now, that human nature could bear so much. Yet I seemed to myself to be observing my strained faculties from a plane apart from them. It was as the owner of a besieged castle might stand on a keep and watch the figures of his men staring out over the battlements at a sight he could not see. There were my eyes looking, my ears listening, even the touch of my fingers on the chair arms questioning what it was that they held. There was I, my very self, far within, waiting for communication. I suppose that I knew there was no escape. I could not descend into the sphere of reason, for another power held the keys. I could not sink again to the inner presence of God, for that chamber too was occupied. There was this last stand to be made, the world of sense. If that was lost, all was lost, and I could not lift a finger to help. And as I said, the strain grew greater each instant, as the opening swell of an organ waxes with a long, steady crescendo to its final roar. I do not know at exactly what point I understood the assault, but it became known to me presently that what was intended was to merge the world of sense, so far as I was concerned, into this mighty essence of evil, to burst through, or rather to transcend the material. Then I knew I should be wholly lost. I remember too that I perceived soon after this that this was what the world calls madness, and I understood at this moment, as never before, how that process consummates itself. It begins, as mine did, with the carrying of the inner life by storm. That may come about by deliberate acquiescence in sin. I should suppose that it always does in some degree. And then the intellect is attacked. It may only be in one point, a delusion it is called, and with many persons regarded only as an eccentric. The process goes no further. But when the triumph is complete, the world of sense too is lost. The man raves. I knew at that time for absolute fact that this is the process. The delusions of the mad are not non-existent. They are glimpses, horrible or foul or fantastic, of that strange world that we take so quietly for granted, that at this moment and at every moment is perpetually about us, foaming out its waters in lust or violence or mad, irresponsible blasphemy against the Most High. Well, I saw that this was what threatened, yet I could not move a finger. No thought of flight entered my mind. All had gone too far by now. Then, gentlemen, the climax came. Again the old priest was silent. I heard Monsigneur's pipe drop with a clatter, and my nerves thrilled like a strung harp. He made no movement to pick it up. He stared only at the old man. Then the quiet voice went on. This was the climax, gentlemen. The intensity swelled and swelled. Each moment I thought must be the last, the utmost effort of hell. Then, with a crash, the full close sounded, and through the rending tear, through the veil of matter that whirled away and was gone, I caught one glimpse of all that lay beneath. It was not through one sense that I perceived it. It was through perception pure and simple. Well, how can I say it? It was this. I perceived two vast forces pressing one against the other, as silent and as rigid as the glass of a diver's helmet against the huge incumbent glimmering water. It is a wretched simile. Let us say that the atmosphere was as the meeting of fire and water without mist or tumult. The forces were absolutely opposed and absolutely alien, yet absolutely one in the plane of being. They could meet as the created and uncreated could not, as flesh and spirit cannot. They meet, travel, level, coincident, each rigid to breaking point, each full of an energy to which there is no parallel in this world. It seemed to me that all had waited for this. The enemy had been permitted to stand in the gate, and at the instant of his triumph the fire of God was upon him, locked in the embrace of utter repulsion. And it was given to me to watch that gentleman, on the edge of what the world labels madness. At the very instant that I hung balanced on that line, I saw that endless war of spirit and spirit, which has been raising since Michael drove Satan from heaven. That ceaseless, untiring conflict in which all that is not for God is against him, seeking to dethrone and annihilate him who gave it being. Words. But I saw it. There was a dead silence in the room. The priest drew one breath. Then I saw no more. I was in my chair as before, holding the arms. The room round me stole back into being, through the pallor of a phantom, to the dusk of earthly twilight, and I perceived that my eyes were closed and not open. There then I stayed, knowing that the war still raged beneath, yet fainter every moment was the tide crawled back, contesting inch by inch, rolled back by that remorseless power. Twice or three times I heard the murmur of sound in the room. The serge curtains swayed. I could hear them. I heard the door vibrating softly. Then once more the quiet silence was there. I heard the ashes slip by their weight from the grate to fender. Matter at last was itself again. And once more, as into my intellect the light stole back, I knew that God reigned, and that his Son was incarnate, crucified and risen, by many irrefragable proofs. Round the house I could hear the murmuring of voices, and see through closed eyelids of utter repose the glimmer of lanterns on the ceiling. Within myself, too, I watched the rout of evil. I drew breath after breath, deep and life-giving, as far down within the secret chambers of my soul the foul filth ebbed and sank, and that spring rising into life everlasting of which our Saviour spoke welled up in its stead, filling every cranny and corner of my soul with that strange sweetness, so sweet and so dear that we forget that as the very air we breathe, the murmur of conflict was infinitely far away, and it seemed to me that once more I went down in that introversion of which I spoke just now, seeing all clean and sweet about me, down into the presence of the Lord who rules heaven and earth at his will. Then a door closed, deep, deep below, and I knew that the enemy was gone. Well, gentlemen, said the priest after a pause, leaning back, that is really the story, but there are a few details to add. When the men that Bridget had fetched came upstairs, they found me asleep, but they told me afterwards there were streaks of foam at the corners of my mouth. Yet she was not gone 3 minutes. I never spoke a word to them of what happened. They knew quite enough for laymen. We had night prayers as usual that evening. I said the Visita Que Sumus Domine at the end. I slept like a child, and I said a mass of thanksgiving the next day. Father Brent broke the silence that followed. His voice seemed strange. And the church, Father? The old priest smiled at him, full. You have guessed it, he said. Yes, the church was built 30 years later. It is a basilica, as I said. It presents our Lord in glory in an apse. It stands curious enough on the rock, but it is in the middle of a huge colliery town, and, well, I may as well say it, there is a grated tribune above the high altar at one side, through which a convent of Poor Clares can assist at the holy sacrifice. Poor Clares. I ceased to wonder at the assault as soon as the convent was built. He stood up, smiling.